Over half a decade and 2 generations ago, we made a video on Shuckle, which we are now updating for the modern day in light of the new information that has been gleaned about this fungal turtle bug. Those who played Gold, Silver, and Crystal, or Heart Gold and Soul Silver, will remember their unusual introduction to this Pokemon. In a house near the gym in Cianwood City lived a Pokemaniac who had previously been visited by a rival, who had bullied him into giving up an unspecified Pokemon. Terrified your rival would return for this beloved Shuckle named Shucky, the Pokemaniac gave it to you for protection. Now you could just keep Shucky forever and never see him again, but if you went back to Cianwood City and talked to him without returning Shucky, he would accuse you of stealing. You could give it back, but if you had racked up high friendship with Shucky, he would let you keep it. An oddly dark subplot that makes the rival less sympathetic for sure. Poor Shuckle and the anxious confusion it must have gone through. Today we're going to see if Shuckle's time in the competitive scene managed to be a little brighter. And so we ask, how great was Shuckle actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Shuckle technically had a niche in the OU of its debut generation. It resisted normal and wasn't weak to Earthquake or Fire Blast, so it could theoretically answer Cursed Snorlax quite well with its utterly monstrous defensive stat. This would also let it absorb Explosion easily. Shuckle's offensive capabilities were non-existent, so it took stalling to an extreme. It wouldn't just Toxic Stall, but it would also PP stall opponents with the massive 64 PP of Defense Curl, the same move that let it thwart Snorlax's attempt to boost with Curse. Shuckle also messed with the opponent further with another high PP move, Flash, whose accuracy lowering effect tended to provoke switches, giving Shuckle a way of abusing the spikes it'd be paired with on stall teams. Sure, this was a bit specific, as there's no way you'd ever use Shuckle on anything but most dedicated hardcore stall teams, but it was a niche, at least. As fun as that sounds to play against, you'd actually welcome facing Shuckle, because its niche was, in reality, incredibly limited, and realistically more gimmicky than useful. Shuckle being passive to the extent that it made Blissey look offensively threatening, made it incredibly exploitable, which would lead to the impenetrable stall team it was a part of becoming more susceptible to getting broken down. Shuckle invited in all sorts of Pokemon in to do whatever they wanted. Fortress to spike and or spin, Nidoking or Gengar to fish for freezes, Steelix to set up Curse, Vaporeon to set up growth, unperturbed by Toxic due to rest, which also tended to be the case for Zapdos or Snorlax trying to recover their own health. Basically, Shuckle did very little other than help win games that were probably winnable in other terms. Its walling and PP stalling ability was not that unique or even consistently useful, since its low HP diluted the potential of its enormous bulk. See how Zapdos' Thunder smacked it particularly hard, for example, and how it was forced to rely on rest for recovery while being vulnerable to spikes. Shuckle wasn't even a guaranteed Snorlax counter, as it got crushed by belly drum variants. Shuckle wasn't going to be too threatening unless the opposing team already couldn't break stall to begin with, or unless the opposing team automatically lost to the move Toxic. If either was the case, that team had bigger problems than just Shuckle. Shuckle was an intriguing case on paper, but not worth much in practice. Shuckle's unmatched passivity meant it was similarly exploitable and rarely useful in UU, but it found a solid place for itself in NU. It was one of the few Pokemon capable of taking on offensive threats that were otherwise immensely difficult to withstand, like Tier King Xatu as well as Stantler, Fearow, and Weezing. Thanks to the tier's incredibly low power level, Shuckle's passivity wasn't as exploitable, and it could potentially even sweep late game against teams no longer packing Water Stab. First, it used Defensive Curl to power up Rollout, and then it'd commit to the Rollout sweep. Spikes from Pineco helped it to do damage when forcing out the Pokemon it walled before it was ready to commit to the sweep. Shuckle could also go for an all-out support set with Encore and Sleep Talk, which expanded its flexibility. So Shuckle's niche was fairly limited, as it only fit on truly bulky teams willing to play the long game, but it was a legitimate choice in GSC NU. With the boom of offensive capabilities introduced by Generation 3, it became more imperative than ever for defensive Pokemon to actually hit back at the Pokemon they were answering, lest they get overwhelmed by their boosting and or repeated hits. As such, Shuckle was completely worthless, even all the way down in NU. Then one day, Shuckle was kidnapped and taken into outer space by a rogue group of astronauts that were rebelling against their original crew. They believed their mission to find intelligent life to be a useless one, without some extra power to defend against a potentially hostile organism. Though this sentiment was not without merit, those rogue astronauts were also under the impression that Shuckle contained within its shell powers from a higher place of existence, which they could harness potentially not just for self-defense, but even for themselves. Not long after that, they accidentally stumbled through a wormhole, finding themselves in another dimension where they were accosted by hostile beings at every corner, and thus Shuckle began its battle against terrifying cosmic beings beyond human comprehension. Indeed, the astronauts that had kidnapped it went insane mere moments after witnessing these beasts, drenched dressed in impossible colors, making impossible sounds, and comprised of impossible matter. But Shuckle did not share their limitations and began to conquer them with an absurd ease. It reveled in this new mode of existence, because why toil away not getting used in Gen 3 NU, or suffer the indignity of pretending it was worth anything with Gen 4's newfound special defense boost in a sandstorm, when it also received a stealth rock weakness, or getting mocked by Gen 5 when it received Shell Smash and Contrary, two incredible traits it had no use for, when instead it could potentially discover the very fabric of existence itself. Shuckle tossed aside these unimaginable space beasts around like ragdolls and earned for itself the name of Shuckle, Grand Emperor of the Cosmic Vortex. Well, that's how it was translated anyway. The sound of the very language from which it originates would drive you to madness, so we better not risk it. Anyway, Shuckle soon realized that there were no more worlds left to conquer in this dimension, and it heard that Pokemon XY were being released soon, so it decided to return to Earth. During the 2012 and the 2013 VGC seasons, Shuckle would devote a piece of its ever-expanding consciousness sufficient to travel and exist as its own entity, to return to Earth and see if it could achieve anything. The answer was a resounding no. If you ever wanted to be consistent, you stayed away from Shuckle. Its only purpose was to try and catch the opponent off guard with levels of cheese potentially lethal for the lactose intolerant. Its main purpose was to use Guard Split to transform its teammate Chansey into an unbreakable, bulky behemoth, allowing its user to then stall the timer and win. However, this was notoriously unreliable, as Guard Split got redirected by Follow Me, disrupted by Fake Out, and had a million other problems. Such teams either caught an unsuspecting, inexperienced player off guard, or got blown out by most anyone with a clue. Suffice to say, they weren't seen much, and when they were seen, they were unceremoniously destroyed. The other strategy Shuckle could attempt to pull off was to use its Contrary ability alongside Latias, which would copy Contrary through roleplay, which made her Draco Meteor go from -2 special attack with each use to +2. But this was as unreliable as it was rare as well, and Shuckle just wasn't worth it. Shuckle hadn't been much of a stealth rocker in Generations 4 and 5 on account of being the least efficient wall in the game, but Gen 6 blessed it with the new entry hazard being introduced, Sticky Web, which lowered the speed of grounded Pokemon by 1 stage. This offered grand new possibilities. With power creep, offensive threats were being answered by dedicated walls less and less, and were instead revenge killed, counterattacked, or out-offense by faster opposing threats. Webs could completely nullify that. Plus, even dedicated walls liked being faster than some threats. Mega Venusaur reveled in outspeeding Mega Mawile, for example. This lent hyper offense teams a massive new degree of potential, and Shuckle was eyed with particular interest because it set up rocks as well as webs, which was huge to allow such teams to pile on as many threats as possible, rather than having 2 slots dedicated to hazards on a team. The only other Pokemon that could set up both rocks and webs was Smeargle. However, neither OU or UU were much affected by webs early in XY. Defog was everywhere, meaning that the value of a Pokemon that existed just to get hazards and die early in the game was questioned. If you were going to do that, you should use something really reliable for it, like a Deoxys form, which was fast and had taunt to prevent opposing hazard setup. Shuckle couldn't stop the opponent from setting up all the hazards in the world. Plus, with its low speed, it didn't do so hot against opposing taunt either. Yes, it could run Mental Herb to shrug off taunt once, but that meant it would have to make the difficult, nearly impossible choice of getting up either rocks or webs. And once the game progressed past the first few turns, it would be similarly tough for it to come back in and set up the second one. Whichever it chose, its team would suffer for it. Plus, in OU, Bisharp would actually punish its speed being dropped thanks to Defiant, and Aegislash actually relished its speed being lowered since that let it make the most of its stance change. While other common threats like Thundurus, Latios, both forms of Landorus, and Mega Charizard Y were unaffected by webs. As such, the strategy was largely overlooked until Shuckle hit RU, where the tier's far lower power level did allow it to reliably set up both rocks and webs consistently. The effects of which were utterly devastating. The tier wasn't only ill-equipped to prevent its setup, it was ill-equipped to counteract it. The tier had limited options for Defog and Rapid Spin, and Shuckle's access to Encore meant it could lock opponents into these moves, making them easier to deal with for its teammates. If it locked a Pokemon into Spin, for example, Shuckle's low speed would work to its advantage, as even if the spinning Pokemon kept using Spin, Shuckle would simply set up a hazard and risklessly switch to a Ghost-type teammate. It didn't even come to this most of the time, though. Shuckle would just get up hazards hazards and enabled the offensive threats in the tier to ridiculous game-breaking degrees, and as such, Shuckle found itself banned from X and Y RU. This was already a massive improvement over its previous generations, but it certainly didn't stop there. Even before RU existed, Shuckle had established itself a niche for itself in Ubers of all tiers. The concept of offensive threats being tougher to handle when you could no longer outspeed them was particularly applicable to the metagame with the strongest Pokemon around, and a massive portion of the tier was affected by webs. Such rewards meant one could justify playing the risky game that was maneuvering Shuckle against common opposing leads like Deoxys speed. However, with teammate support, Shuckle found itself surprisingly consistent, on par with its fellow sticky web user Smeargle. While Smeargle's superior move pool obviously had its advantages, Shuckle's ability to actually take hits let it get both hazards quite consistently, especially against bulkier Pokemon, and in a pinch, it also had a built-in focus sash with Sturdy, allowing it to run Mental Herb as its item to shrug off taunt. Webs had a massive host of applications in Ubers. Most notably, they made Choice Specs Kyogre disgustingly difficult to deal with, while setup threats such as Arceus, Ground, and Mega Lucario appreciated the slowing down of would-be faster threats as well. Even the really fast ones, like all three forms of Mewtwo, could enjoy the effects of webs, which removed the Choice Scarfer's ability to check them. Webs even had solid defensive applications. By limiting Xerneas to a +1 speed after a Geomancy boost, it could actually be revenge killed by Choice Scarf Genesect. Sticky Web was a high-risk, high-reward playstyle, and Shuckle was a significant part of this. Sadly, Sticky Web significantly fell out of favor with the arrival of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. The re-edition of the Soul Duality twins meant that the best, most popular defoggers in the tier were both fast and hovered above Sticky Web, as opposed to XY. The addition of Mega Salamence as another monstrous Webs immune threat didn't help matters either. Webs was just too risky, especially considering how reliable a Choice Standard Hyper offense was. However, it and Shuckle had its time in XY. Shuckle wasn't done with Gen 6 just yet though. Deep in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, it reared its head again. The metagame had become well known for how unreliable and exploitable its hazard removing options were. This mostly tended to manifest in the form of balanced spikes teams, but Sticky Web, anchored by Shuckle, took the concept in a much more hyper-offensive direction and generally provided a significant rejuvenation for fast-paced teams in general. Even its greatest nemesis, Mega Diancie, and its Magic Bounce could be worked around if Shuckle held Red Card. Diancie would attack, Red Card would activate, Diancie would be forced out, and the hazard would go up. This effort to set webs was a worthwhile one, as with its support, offensive Sword Dance Mega Scizor became one of the most terrifying Pokemon in the tier. Would-be answers like Keldeo and Heatran couldn't hope to check it anymore, and it was far from being the only threat too, as Bisharp became similarly terrifying. So did Belly Drum Azumarill. Tail Glow of Manaphy was so utterly ridiculous with web support, some considered it outright broken. All of these Pokemon were at least strong in their own right pre-webs, but Thundurus Therian also saw a significant burst in popularity, with the speed lowering of its opponents allowing it to make full use of the significantly higher special attack it boasted over its incarnate form. Gengar and even base Hoopa saw used to help Shuckle play around Exejo's Rapid Spin, but were also excellent web-supported threats in their own right. Stacking such obscene offensive pressure was absolutely ridiculous for balanced teams to deal with, while opposing offensive teams were slowed down and ruined by the speed drop. At first, webs was diminished as gimmicky cheese, but it soon proved that false, as it simply won too consistently for that to be the case, and eventually, it was a different outcry. A significant portion of the player base genuinely believed webs to be broken and demanded action to be taken against it. This was all of Shuckle's doing too. It was always the web setter, as its bulk helped to get rocks as well with consistency. Then, just as instantly webs had exploded onto the scene, it disappeared. It had been entirely superseded by a new style of hyper offense, that of dual screens, which similarly exploded onto the scene and took the metagame by storm, and it outclassed webs entirely, as it was far easier to reliably set up both screens with something as fast as superior, thus enabling monstrous threats like Volcarona and making Manaphy even more threatening because screens let it beat faster Pokemon that be unaffected by Sticky Web. No more getting checked by Specs Latios, for example. Superior's newfound popularity also killed Sticky Web so much so that it was a thorn in the side of web teams by itself. Its contrary ability meant that it would actually get a speed boost from Sticky Web. Nevertheless, webs had a strong run, capping off a breakout generation for Shuckle, a ban from RU, a solid stint in Ubers, and for a brief time, believed to be enabling a broken playstyle in OU. And just like that, Shuckle disappeared again in Generation 7. Hazard removal options improved significantly, especially in Ultra Sun and Moon when absolutely everything got defogged, so maintaining the hazard was much harder, making dedicating a Pokemon just to set it up and immediately be KO'd that much riskier. And there were even new Sticky Web users, Araquanid and Rabombi, while Slurpuff gained the move as well. These were actually genuinely good Pokemon in their own right, in addition to setting webs, meaning it didn't matter nearly as much that they didn't also get rocks, or if they weren't able to maintain the hazard at all costs. There was no way Shuckle was going to compete with them, so from OU through RU it didn't stand a chance, and with how ridiculously popular Magic Bounce Xatu was in NU, it was never going to be worthwhile to use Shuckle there either. And even all the way down in PU, it just wasn't a reliable strategy. Not only was maintaining the hazard a complete nightmare, the benefits weren't quite there either, with plenty of the tier's popular Pokemon either already being slow or ignoring webs. The tier's offensive threats didn't necessarily gel with webs too well, but they also didn't need it either. As such, Shuckle fell to untiered in Generation 7. In Gen 7 VGC, the previous 15-minute timer was replaced with quote-unquote your time, a 10-minute timer that counted down only when you were selecting your moves. This would fix the issue of getting stalled out, right? Not quite. If you know what you want to do beforehand, which isn't difficult when your plan is a simple stalling pattern, it doesn't take long to select your move at all. Thus, stalling the timer was still a viable gimmick strategy. When a game went to time, you considered how many Pokemon were left, and when there were the same number of Pokemon, it was dependent on the percentage of health remaining. As such, Chansey would always win in a 1v1 last Pokemon scenario thanks to its gargantuan HP. And what does Shuckle have to do with this? Why, it went a long way in enabling Chansey with its guard split, of course. Afterwards, it would help stall the opponent via Toxic. Riveting stuff. Not particularly reliable, of course, which is why it was rare, but Ike Marvin Gilcher did reach 8th with a Chansey Shuckle timeout stall team at the April 2018 Taiwan special event. So, there's that. With the addition of the immensely popular heavy-duty boots in Generation 8, it should come as to no surprise that Shuckle was completely worthless and wound up in untiered again. Its access to knockoff was nowhere near enough justification to run a team slot dedicated to something that didn't affect significant portion of teams. However, while Shuckle was completely unseen in OU through PU, it actually found a serious niche for itself in Ubers. Yes, there were boots and defog aplenty in that tier as well, but here's the thing. The threats in Ubers were so powerful that they could maintain enough pressure to burst through the opposing team without giving them room to defog. And while not everything ran boots, slowing down the Pokemon that didn't hold them had a game-changing effect, such as Pokemon like Caloric Shadow, Kyogre, Xerneas, and several variants of Eternatus. This allowed massive threats like Necrozma Duskmane and one's own Caloric Shadow to go absolutely berserk. The speed drop gave an edge in offense-on-offense matchups, while the threats were so dangerous they had little issues with bulkier styles, making Sticky Web quite a solid choice for hyper offense. And Shuckle was its anchor, with its immense bulk coming in handy, as it was quite easy for it to live 2 Xerneas Moonblasts, for example. Hilarious though it is, Gen 8 Shuckle was simultaneously untiered while also being genuinely good and important in Ubers. The strangeness of competitive Pokemon on full display. Timer Stall with Shuckle returned with a very slow-paced vengeance. Kind of. In 2021, Hudson Rhodes reached 7th with such a team at the 5th Spring Series Victory Road qualifier. The combination was particularly effective when enabled by Fake Out Lightbird as well as Trick Room, with further support from Nasty Plot Spectre, adding a new dimension of threat that had previously been lacking. Lo Wai-Yin also used such a team to reach 25th at the 2nd Hatterene Series, but with Caloric Shadow over Spectre. The strategy was unreliable overall, hence its low usage, but it had its place. And that's it. So how great was Shuckle actually? Well, it's actually had quite an interesting career. It started with a gimmicky PP stalling niche in OU, true to its defensive stature, but was more of an NU Pokemon. Then seeing how it was completely worthless in singles in Gens 3 through 5, it went to space on a fun little adventure where it confronted untold eldritch horrors. Though it occasionally took a break for VGC gimmicks, it's never been much of a VGC presence, but at least it has its place, even if that place is cheesy timer stall silliness. Everything changed upon Shuckle's full-time return to Earth in Gen 6, where it learned Sticky Web and embarked on a series of more grounded adventures. What a pun, first of all. But second of all, this move let Shuckle get banned from X and Y RU, have a niche in X and Y Ubers, and for a time, even the move considered broken in ORAS OU. It was pretty useless in Gen 7, sadly, and once again in Gen 8, being untiered in both. Except for the part where, despite being untiered, it was actually quite good in Ubers. So overall, Shuckle is a testament for the weirdness of competitive Pokemon, fitting for a Pokemon so unbalanced in design. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, how would you buff Shuckle? Go crazy. I really want to see what y'all come up with. Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow Maikiri on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.